Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Justin Douglas, pronouns he, him. I'm a third-year grad student from Southern California studying social work and public policy in the joint degree program at SSA in Harris. I work as the graduate assistant for the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, and I'm the co-founder of the UChicago Black Grad Coalition, a group focused on building Black community here on campus through interdisciplinary collaboration, both on campus and community activism and civic engagement. Today's topic on voter suppression is a timely one and very central to the work that Black Grad Coalition is currently doing around racial justice and Black-centered advocacy. For example, we're just wrapping up an exciting collaborative project with the Organization of Black Students and the IOP's own organization, UShy Votes, to create a voting advocacy video campaign, encouraging the Black community to turn out and vote in this upcoming election. Because their votes matter and communities of color deserve fair access to the democratic process. We're excited that this topic is being addressed today. So now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker. Eric Holder served as the 82nd Attorney General of the United States under President Barack Obama, the first African American to ever hold the position. A New York native, Holder attended Columbia University as an undergraduate and then went on to graduate with his JD from Columbia Law School. Prior to his appointment as Attorney General, Holder worked for the Public Integrity Section at the U.S. Department of Justice as a U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia and as Deputy Attorney General. As Attorney General, Holder dealt with issues pertaining to a range of important topics, from civil rights to the war on terror, and we're very grateful to have him here. Serving as today's moderator is IOP fellow Jelani Cobb. Also no stranger to New York City, Jelani is the Ira A. Lippman Professor at Holder's alma mater, Columbia University, and is a regular staff contributor to The New Yorker. Jelani has written several books, articles, and essays, my favorite of which is titled To the Break of Dawn, a freestyle on the hip hop aesthetic. Thank you both for being here today.
All right. Well, thank you.
So I'm really happy to be able to talk to you today. I know we had a conversation, we had a dialogue, I guess it was about 10 days ago now on these issues at the New Yorker Festival. But one feature of the era we're living in is that 10 days can feel like 6 months.
Yeah, that's true.
And so I wondered if we could just start out with a basic overview. We're talking about voter suppression and the upcoming election. What are the things that most concern you as we are just less than 2 weeks out from the actual election day?
Well, I'm concerned that one party in this country has made a determination that it needs to suppress the vote. We can say suppress, it needs to cheat in order to win an election. Now, you start with that construct, and that leads to a whole range of things that worry me. I mean, unnecessary photo ID laws, the weakening of the postal service so that you don't have the ability to deliver votes by mail. Coming up with ways in which polling places have been closed, voter purges that have occurred, up to this time. There's a whole range of things that give me concern. And then, who knows what's going to happen, on election day. President Trump's talking about the Trump army. Supposedly 50,000 people will be poll watchers dispatched around the country. My guess is they'll be disproportionately dispatched to the battleground states. And who knows how they will, conduct themselves. So I'm worried about a whole range of things. And the thing is, Jelani, this isn't stuff that is, by chance. This isn't stuff that is just kind of, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. This is part of a national plan to try to suppress the vote, keep Democrats, people of color, young people away from the polls, to try to maintain power.
You've been involved in these issues a great deal of time. You certainly are familiar with the landscape. And I wonder if you were surprised by anything that you've seen emerge in recent years as it relates to this topic.
I think the thing that surprises me is first the creativity that is demonstrated by the other side in coming up with ways in which they keep people away from the polls or make it more difficult for people to vote. And then the other part of it is just the brazenness of it. I mean, if you look at, Governor Abbott in Texas, he says that you can only have one drop box per county in a state as large as Texas. Harris County, one drop box, I think it's like 4 million people who live there. I think Harris County is as large as the state of Rhode Island. And to say you can only have one drop box there. Now, there is no justification for that other than you want to make it difficult for people you perceive to be Democrats, people you perceive to be in opposition to the governor. You want to make it difficult for them to get to the polls. And that is just out front. That's just there. It's the same thing we saw with Brian Kemp in Georgia, the brazenness of, while he's Secretary of State, he's supposed to be the referee in all things election. And he is purging people, from the voting rolls, and then resigns and gets elected governor. So I think that's the thing that has really gotten me. These folks have simply said, we're going to do whatever it is that we have to do in order to win, and we don't care if you see us doing it.
I mean, one of the things I think about the Brian Kemp situation in Georgia was that it was stunning to your point about just brazenly running for governor while overseeing the election you're running in. There's no bigger definition of a conflict of interest. And then, I think the ACLU report said that they purged 300,000 names from the rolls, only to find that 200,000 of those people were actually supposed to be eligible voters
right.
after the fact. And so it is striking. I wonder, what's changed? What's motivated this sense of brazenness and the idea that this can be done just overtly?
Well, I think a couple of things have happened. First, I think it's an indication of the desperation of the Republican Party. They understand the demographics are going against them, that the ideological tides in this country are going against them. And they realize that they're going to have to do the things that they are doing if they want to maintain power. And this is really all about power gaining and power retention. The other thing is that after the Shelby County decision in 2013, when the Supreme Court, in an awful 5-4 decision, essentially gutted significant portions of the Voting Rights Act, and that left the states free to do all of these really brazen, negative things without any kind of check by the United States Department of Justice. I mean, immediately after the Shelby County decision, so 25 states put into place these unnecessary photo ID laws. Since that time, we've seen 1,700 polling places close around the country. We've seen voter purges go up by about 40%. And so the Supreme Court, in that decision, that ideological decision, that partisan decision, made a determination that let the states do what it is that they thought that they had to do, and without any kind of check on them. And it's only been made worse, by, I guess, the Rutro decision, I guess, last term, where the Supreme Court says we're not going to get involved in partisan gerrymandering cases. So you can expect, that being the case, that you will see attempts to really go to town next year when it's time to redistrict, and Republicans, where they have the power, will really try to gerrymander themselves into power or keep themselves in power.
I know gerrymandering is an issue that you've been very active on. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how that factors into the overall, playing field that we see now regarding voter suppression.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a coincidence, and you can just look at this. I mean, this is just factually true, that where you see the greatest amount of gerrymandering, you also see the greatest amount of voter suppression. Because the reality is gerrymandered legislatures, that is legislatures that have a disproportionate number of, let's say in this case, Republicans, like in Wisconsin. Democrats get 54% of the vote and only get 1/3 of the seats in the state legislature. The 2/3 of the legislature that is controlled by Republicans can then pass all of these voter suppression laws. Democrats might complain about it, but it doesn't matter. They don't have the power to stop it. And when they had Governor Scott Walker there to sign those laws into place, that put Wisconsin right up front when it came to voter suppression. So gerrymandering allows what is a popular vote minority the ability to draw districts in such a way that they have power, and then they have this power that they use to keep themselves in power by suppressing the vote of the political opposition.
So I wonder, we've had these conversations, I guess, multiple times as we were approaching this election. And one of the things that you often hear on the other side, when you hear people kind of being critical of this, the response you hear from people on the other side of this question is they're concerned with the integrity of elections. They are trying to make sure that there's no untoward behavior that cancels out the votes of people who are supposed to be counted in our elections. What do you make of that?
All right, now everybody listen really carefully here. That's nonsense. Nonsense. All the studies have shown that empirically, the incidence of in-person voter fraud is infinitesimal and is not consequential. You know, Trump put this commission together, headed by that great patriot, Chris Kobach, to try to find instances of voter fraud so that they could, you know, come up with regulations, rules, propose laws, and it collapsed of its own weight. I mean, the Brennan Center did a study and said that you're more likely to be hit by lightning than cast an in-person fraudulent vote. But, you know, so there's no basis for that claim. And what gets me about it, if they were, let's say, truly caring about that, you would hope that they would kind of weight the things and say, all right, you know, weigh the things and say, well, you know, if we put these laws in effect to try to stop in-person voter fraud, what are the collateral consequences of that? And we now know that that means if you put these measures in place, it's going to be more difficult for people of color, for poor people, and for young people to get to the polls. Now, that is not, as I said before, that's not coincidence. That is deliberate. And so they use the ruse of voter fraud to do that which they want to do, which is all about partisan retention of power.
Mm. You know, I got an email. The documentary we did aired, I think 2 nights ago. Like, this week is a blur to me. But the documentary we did for Frontline, Whose Votes Count, aired. And I got an interesting email from someone. It was an earnest email. I get a lot of emails I just delete immediately. But this was an earnest email where the person said, you know, I've watched your film and, you know, I saw the conversations that you had about voter ID, and I just don't see how this is a problem. You know, people show ID for lots of other things. And, you know, I was open to it. I thought about it. And I just, you know, decided that I'd prefer to err on the side of caution and have people show an ID, you know, before they vote. Can you talk about the implications of, you know, the policy and how it has come to have the reverberations that it does?
Yeah, you know, and I respect somebody who says that as an earnest concern, you know, but the reality is that, you know, it's not as if there were no identification requirements before. I mean, people are like what, people just showed up and voted. No, you had to show that, you know, if you're Eric Holder, you in fact were Eric Holder when you came to vote, but you could show that by showing, you know, a rent receipt, a gas bill, an electric bill, you know, anything that would really, you know, justifiably would connect you to the person who you say you were. What has happened in recent years is they've come up with these very prescriptive ways in which you have to prove your identity. And these requirements they have in place are much less likely to be in the possession of people who are the political opponents of the people who are putting these things forward. You know, we say, oh, everybody's got a driver's license. No, everybody doesn't have a driver's license. In fact, if you're poor, you're much less likely to own a car. People of color, less likely to own cars. And then you look at what they did in Texas. If you have an ID, a state-issued ID, picture ID that says you're allowed to carry a gun, concealed weapon, whatever it is, that's okay. If, on the other hand, you have a state-issued University of Texas ID that says you are a student there, that's not okay. So what does that tell you? You know, it's not about voter fraud. And I respect, again, that earnest person. But I hope that person would do the research and understand what the collateral negative consequences are of these extremely prescriptive laws, especially when there really is no problem to confront. There is no problem that we have to be worried about.
Mhm. I think one of the things that's been surprising to me is the way that the kind of cynical way that this is operated. I said to say I was in North Carolina 4 years ago with Reverend William Barber, who, as you know, has been very deeply involved in these issues in his home state. And there was a guy who was a kind of exasperated state legislator who said, in response to being accused of suppressing votes, because people are Black, he said, we don't suppress your votes because you're Black. We suppress your votes because you vote for Democrats.
Right.
Which was kind of besides the point. You're not supposed to be suppressing people's votes. But this is, it's kind of out there. You can go through, I think, at least 10 different statements there are where people have made, people in various tiers of the Republican Party have said the objective of these laws is to diminish voter turnout, including Justin Clark, who is the counsel for the Trump campaign.
Right.
Saying that Republicans have traditionally, he said Republicans have traditionally been suppressing votes. And so I wonder why it's taken so long for this to become the issue that it is. People have been very upfront about what they were attempting to do.
Yeah, I mean, you see stuff, Republicans saying it, back in the 80s, but I think the efforts that we have seen in recent times have been, Republican voter suppression on steroids. And Princeton, for instance, did a study looking at the gerrymandering that was done by Republicans in 2011 and said it was the worst of the past half century. And that gerrymandering led to the voter suppression laws that we saw starting after the lines were redrawn in 2011, and we've had to deal with over the course of this past decade. And those numbers that I gave in Wisconsin, 54% of vote for Democrats, only 1/3 of the seats, replicated in Ohio, in North Carolina, in other parts, of the country as well. So, it's a sad commentary. I think we become numb to this after a while, and we almost accept, that guy said, wait a minute, I'm not being racially inappropriate. I'm just trying to suppress the votes of Democrats, as if that's okay. And you think about that. Our democracy is supposed to be about the thing that makes us exceptional is the capacity of American citizens to affect the policy choices of the nation, the direction of the nation. And this guy's saying, well, we're just going to keep Democrats away from the polls. What's wrong with that? And we need to kind of pull back, from all the partisan stuff and say, is this the America that we want? Is this how we want democracy to be defined in the United States of America? I would think everybody, whether Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, progressive, whatever, this would be something that you would stand against.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that just from my perspective as a historian, just as a pragmatist, one of the reasons that if I had the ability to prevent people who I disagree with vehemently, if I had the ability to prevent them from voting or make voting more difficult for them, I would not. Simply because democracy is a frail system. Even at its strongest, democracy is a fairly frail system.
Right.
That people who feel like they can't get their voice heard, or at least get a fair hearing for their issue through the official mechanisms, start finding the unofficial mechanisms attractive. And those unofficial mechanisms are more often than not violent. Yeah. And so the general well-being of the society I've always thought of as being central to that. The other thing I think that's really interesting about this is when we talk about voter suppression, if we just did a kind of word association, people might get an image of Selma, John Lewis and the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and the states of the former Confederacy and poll taxes, and the kind of narrative that maybe if you took a history, an African American history class, you would have learned about those things. And we're now seeing this in areas that are far outside the South, right, and impacting communities that are not necessarily African Americans. And I wonder if you could talk about that, about the kind of breadth of this modern incarnation of it.
Yeah, I mean, well, the Supreme Court decision that essentially said that it's okay to require these photo IDs Justice Stevens, late Justice Stevens, said, boy, that was like maybe the worst vote that he ever cast as a Supreme Court justice. That was about an Indiana law, and so we have seen these photo ID laws pop up, these suppression tactics pop up, not only in the South, in the old Confederacy, the states that were covered by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but also in Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, the Midwest. And then, if you look out west as well, you also see it there. So it's not something that is regional in nature. This is now something that is nationwide in scope. And, I think, unfortunately, you see, an abundance of it in those states that are controlled by Republicans, and that's a painful thing for me to say, because I don't want this to seem partisan. And yet you can't run away from, from the reality. By and large, you're seeing Democrats trying to make it easier for people to vote, and Republicans are making it more difficult. And, the answer shouldn't be, we're going to keep Democrats away from the polls. It ought to be like, the party should question itself. Why are we not appealing to people? How can we change our ideological appeal so that we attract more people to our side? I think the reality is that, conservatism, you say the conservative era started maybe in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. I think it's exhausted. I think it's exhausted. I'm just not sure they've got many good ideas, many new ideas. I think we're actually on the verge of another progressive era. And that is what Republicans are pushing against. They want to hold that off for as long as is possible.
I think one of the things that's interesting about the language we've heard has been the overt tones, overtly threatening tones. And so in the first debate, when Donald Trump said, he made the call for people to go out to Philadelphia and said, a lot of bad things happen in Philadelphia, et cetera. And, not coincidentally, gave that shout out to the Proud Boys. And I wonder if you're concerned, or to the extent you are concerned, about the possibility of violence in the upcoming election. Do you think that's a realistic fear?
I think, unfortunately, it is a realistic fear. Most of me thinks that we're going to probably get through this, okay. There might be, sporadic incidents. But I think what we have to realize here, Steve Schmidt said it, I think, really well, and it kind of goes along with what you said about how fragile democracy is. And statements like that from the leader of the United States are really worrisome. That's really, really of concern. Steve said that, fascism won out in Europe in the middle of the 20th century, not because fascism was strong, but because democracy was weak. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is something that we ought to think about. We need to do the things that are going to strengthen our democracy, make us impervious to the kinds of things that, we should be concerned about: takeovers, violence, anarchy, autocratic rule. We have to strengthen democracy, and we do that by making sure that our electoral infrastructure works, that it is fair, that it's strengthened against attempts to subvert it. And that, it seems to me, ought to be something that all Americans, ought to be able to agree upon. And if it means some short-term partisan disadvantage, okay, regroup, come up with better ideas, make yourself more appealing. If you're in the Republican Party, come up with ways in which you make outreach to people who are African-American, people who are Hispanic. Figure out ways in which you can attract young people to the party. Don't try to suppress their votes.
Mm-hmm. Are you concerned? I guess I'll reframe this. At what point did you become concerned about the possibility and reality of hostile foreign intervention in our elections?
Okay, and without revealing too much here, I mean, let me just say this. When I was the Attorney General, we started every day at 8:30 at the FBI. You go to a really, enclosed, secure room, and you look at the raw intelligence for the last 24 hours, including, you look at the PDB, the Presidential Daily Brief. And it was during my time as Attorney General that I became concerned on the basis of, things that were presented to me about, foreign intervention. It became clear by 2016 that a lot of the things that were more sporadic in nature that I had the chance to, to view, that by 2016 there were, concerted attempts, much more organized attempts, state-sponsored attempts to do that which I had the opportunity to view before. So I would say, maybe towards the end of my time as Attorney General, 14, 15, and then certainly what we saw in 16 kind of brought it to fruition.
Yeah, I wonder about the thing that I find is interesting about it is that, the overlap, because, people have been getting emails we've seen now about intimidation, voter intimidation tactics and things saying, we know who you are, we know you're a Democrat, if you vote for Biden, we'll come get you. And it struck me because that you don't really have to be a genius to see the echo of that in American history. It's that people have looked at very closely what would happen if you decided to register in Georgia in 1955, right. Or if you decided that you were going to try to vote in Alabama in 1961 or any of those things. And I just am struck. I don't think it's really a question in there. I'm just struck by the parallel of seeing those.
Well, but see, Jelani, you raise a good point. And if you're a person of color, this stuff will resonate with you. You've heard about this before. You've had relatives who talk about this before. You read about it, studied it. But this is maybe different for some of our white brothers and sisters who are now going to be hearing these kinds of things. We know who you are. We know that if you vote, we're gonna come and get you. That's something that unfortunately is part of the African American experience, and especially in the South. And this might now be something that that people are more generally going to have to deal with around the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I take from the history of this, of African Americans in this country, is that there's always been this kind of idea of people who don't want to. If you teach Black history, there are a lot of people who do not want to hear what you have to say. Particularly there'll be like white students who are like, we're just going to feel guilty. Not saying that there aren't. There are plenty of white students who took my classes. But I'm saying there would be another set who would feel like, oh, we're going to feel terrible. We're just going to hear all these things that are awful and so on. And sometimes there were Black students who felt that same way. They didn't want to. They looked at the history of Black people in this country as a kind of unbroken trail of misery. But the importance of that is that we were mapping out the exact parameters of American democracy. Right. You go like, these are your fault lines. Lots of people know these things. Lots of people outside, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union understood America's racial liabilities. And I guess that was the kind of point that I was trying to get to, that the way that our inability and unwillingness to grapple with the racial problems in this country have not been, are no longer a domestic problem, but they are international liability.
No, I think that's right. I got a lot of grief back in, I guess, February of 2009 when I gave a Black History Week speech at the Justice Department.
I vaguely remember that.
Yeah. And I said the nation, that when it came to dealing with racial issues, that we were a nation of cowards. Mm-hmm. And I used that provocative language. I thought that would generate, make the speech kind of pop a little, stand out. I didn't anticipate quite the reaction that I did get, but I think that's true. The reality is that we, as a nation, are expert at avoiding talking about racial things. And I get it, it's painful, it's awkward. These are things that maybe you want to try to avoid, but if we want to get to a better place, we've got to be conversant with our racial past if we want to understand our racial present and understand the diverse nation that we're about to have. And if you want to understand voter suppression, you got to understand the history of Black people in this country. I mean, from the time of emancipation, it's been like, all right, How do we prevent these people from voting? I mean, that has been the deal, whether it's the creation of, felon disenfranchisement, poll taxes, literacy tests, and then just use of outright violence. If you want to study voter suppression, if you want to understand it in its latest manifestations, you really got to understand the history of it, and that takes you right back to Black history.
Yeah, I mean, it's like any team that would study game tape, going like, what did we do right and what did we do wrong? It's like, and the equivalent, I think sometimes we approach the history of this country as saying we're only going to study our touchdowns and not going to study the interceptions we threw. And so with all of this, I know this is kind of a weighty thing. I think there's a lot that people are concerned about, and a lot of anxiety ahead. What can be done? What are some of the things? I know we'll make sure that we have time for the questions from the students. What are some of the things that can be done to address this issue?
Well, I think you could start with, and this will require, electoral wins by Democrats. It'll also require probably the elimination of the filibuster. But you could, for instance, assuming Biden's president, Democrats control the Senate, no filibuster, Democrats control the House, pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that essentially puts back into place and enhances actually the 1965 Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court gutted. And that would, it's actually be a better law because it would be nationwide in its jurisdiction. It wouldn't just be the covered states of the old Confederacy. And that would put a big check on some of the things that have been done. It would put the federal government back as a player and really stop states and localities from doing these kind of unnecessary and inappropriate things. HR 1 passed by the House would also, take dark money out of the system and put in place these commissions to do, to draw the lines. Again, that would strengthen our electoral infrastructure. So there's a whole range of things that can be done now. And if people will get to and focus on down ballot races, and we elect people who will, focus on, again, strengthening our electoral structure, doing away with gerrymandering. Just because Wisconsin is a gerrymandered state now doesn't mean it has to always be that way. You get right-thinking Republicans and Democrats into the legislature, they can undo those gerrymanders. They can do redistricting in an appropriate way. I'm working with Arnold Schwarzenegger, a Republican, in trying to protect the creation that we both lobbied for last year of an independent commission in Missouri. And there are lots of Republicans who around the country who I'll talk to about this stuff. They'll quietly say, "Yeah, we're with you." They won't stand up necessarily and raise their hands unless they're saying, "Well, you're not standing up against Democratic gerrymandering," when in fact I am opposed to Democratic gerrymandering. So we need to get Republicans, I think right-thinking Republicans, involved in the fight against voter suppression as well, because I can't think that that the right-thinking average Republican is totally comfortable with the notion that his or her party is involved in the best explanation give is, well, we're just suppressing the vote of Democrats. We're not racists. We're just suppressing the vote of Democrats. They can't feel comfortable. They can't feel comfortable with that.
Yeah. I think that I've seen those kinds of same inklings. And I was in a meeting of a group of people who were trying to get rid of the Electoral College. And I was expecting this to be kind of liberal to left people. There were a number of Republicans who were involved in it, just because they thought that the same thing we were talking about earlier, that the long-term forecast of the country doesn't look good if you have these kind of repeated splits between what the people want in large numbers, large majorities, and what they wind up with as a result of whatever political mechanisms of the Electoral College culminate.
And if you just want to look at this from as a matter of self-interest, the reality is that the Electoral College can turn against you. I mean, people tend to forget that when George W. Bush was running for re-election, if John Kerry had won Ohio, Bush would have been a defeated president, would not have had a second term, in spite of the fact that he would have won the popular vote. So it's not that far away that Republicans could have been on the other side, in the same way that if the Russians decide that for whatever reason, the Republican candidate is not going to be somebody who is going to help them out, and they think the Democrat is going to be better, and so the Russians go all in to try to help a Democratic candidate win. They don't care about Republicans and Democrats. They're just looking at it. The Russians are just looking at it in their own national self-interest, and they could turn on the Republicans and decide they're going to do all they can to make sure that candidate X for the Democrats is elected president.
Yeah, that's kind of a scary prospect for our elections to be contingent upon the best interests of a foreign power.
Right.
One last thing I'll ask, which I hate to ask with like 2 minutes before we have to go to other questions, but how much of this do you think is in reaction to the fact that a Black man was elected president of the United States?
I think that intensified the feeling. I think there was certainly a reaction to Barack's election as president. And so I think that, that made the feelings more intense. I mean, the Tea Party, yeah, they were against, healthcare and all of that stuff. But boy, there was an undercurrent there of racial animus. And I think that that's also true, certainly I think we saw in 2010, the election where, President Obama famously said we got shellacked. I think there was a racial component to that. I don't want to make too much of it. There was a political reaction, I think, as well. But I think, the sight of this emerging Obama coalition was frightening to, a lot of people. And it still is, this notion that the nation is becoming more brown, that you could have brown people, as leaders of the country. And what is that going to mean for that which is, still the largest tribe in the country, white folks. So I think there's a lot of, fear, concern, and I think that's what Trump has played upon, and it said, in essence, when he talks about making America great again, he's going to think like, I want you to go back to what, like 1950s America with picket fences, June Cleaver's wearing pearls and nice dresses while she's doing the housework, all that stuff. And, that's when women were kind of kept in their place. Black folks were kind of kept in their place, and everything's going to be okay. We're not going to, it's almost as if, Trump and the people who are, I think, trying to suppress votes, they're afraid of the future. And so what they want to do is embrace a past that really never existed or didn't exist in the way that they try to caricature it. And so I think the election of Obama was in a lot of ways kind of the personification, the electoral personification of that fear.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question from a student, which we'll have a combination here. Some students will come onto the screen to ask the question themselves, and I'll read some for people who don't necessarily want to do that. And this is from Arushi Bansal, who's in the class of 2024 at the college. And the question is, how does COVID-19 exacerbate voter suppression, especially in the context of the 2020 presidential election? And what are the implications of that?
Yeah, I think that the virus has given those who want to suppress the vote another way in which to do it. Now, because the logical thing is to say, all right, you know what? We're not going to make people choose between their health and their desire to cast a ballot. So we're going to let more people vote at home. And we know, as we looked at all the surveys, that Democrats are more likely to do that than Republicans. For whatever reason, Republicans want to cast votes, right, that's fine. And so what the virus has allowed is for Republicans to say, what we're going to do? We're going to try to make it more difficult for people to use the mails to vote or to vote by mail, the actual structure itself. We're going to make sure that you have 2 signatures. We're going to make sure that, we're going to somehow, the Trump administration is going to somehow have a negative, have a negative impact on the postal service. And so all of this stuff, again, looking at that, which is kind of like almost in a weird, disgusting way, it's almost like a gift. The virus is a gift to people who want to suppress the vote. Just gives them more mechanisms to come up with. Because if everybody's going to voting by mail, well then photo IDs are not nearly as important. So you have to come up with other ways in which you can suppress the vote. And so we'll make it more difficult for people to vote by mail. And that's, I think, one of the ways in which the virus has helped in terms of voter suppression.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's kind of one of the things I remember, and I think I'll always remember, is the sight of those lines in Wisconsin, which is horrifying, on April 7th, where there were hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people standing out because they insisted on having the election in person.
Yeah.
In the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it. Again, it's logical. All right, we're in the middle of a pandemic in Wisconsin, so people want to stay at home and vote and stay safe. And no, Republicans there said, no, what we're going to do is make you show up and in person and cast. And those long lines that Jelani talks about, that picture of that young woman holding up that sign that said, "This is ridiculous." I mean, it's an iconic picture, and is a testament to the lengths to which people will go to suppress the vote, to make it more difficult for people to vote only for partisan reasons. And Robin Vos, I guess, was the Speaker of the House in Wisconsin, famously came out and on the day of the election in full protective gear. I mean, full protective gear, mask, gown, the whole thing, and said it's safe for everybody to go to the polls and vote. I'm like, really? I mean, look at this dude. He's got right. He could go in, he could do brain surgery in the way that he was fully gowned. And he's saying, but average citizens, so go ahead, just go ahead and vote.
Right. We have a question from Yang, a grad student in sociology. And so she should be on the screen in a moment.
Sure.
Sorry, Pete.
Yeah, great to see you, Eric and William. So I'm a grad student from sociology. Right now I'm living in Chicago, actually stuck in Chicago and could not go back home at this point. So my question is about foreign election interference. So in both recent news reports and last night's debate, there were general discussion of foreign election interference activity, not only from Russia, but also Iran and China. In fact, Trump appointed Attorney General William Barr said recently that he believed China was more of a threat than Russia when it came to election interference, but without offering any details. So how could foreign election interference become less of a selective, self-serving partisan issue than an empirical threat level graded and bipartisan issue? How would you characterize the differences of threat in this reported election interference program in Russia, Iran, and China?
Well, I mean, I think it's a difficult question to answer in this regard. If the intelligence communities could be totally transparent and just reveal to the nation all the intelligence that we have gathered, identifying, what nations, what groups we need to be concerned about, that would be in some ways, I think, the best disinfectant. But you can't do that because you don't want to reveal sources and methods, the means by which we get our intelligence. And so it has to get filtered through the leaders of our intelligence community. And you would hope that they would not be partisan in nature in discussing these threats, pointing to China. And again, I've not seen recent intelligence, but pointing to China and saying that, they're as big a threat as is Russia. I suspect that's probably not the case. I can't say that I know that for a fact. And to try to come up with a narrative that is consistent, you're characterizing China, for instance, in a way that's consistent with a narrative that the president is trying to push. That's ultimately not the role of the intelligence community, and ultimately doesn't help the nation prepare itself for dealing with clearly other nations that want to interfere in our electoral process. So I would hope that we will get back to normal, where we have our intelligence officials who generally, sometimes, Democrats sometimes appoint Republicans to lead, various components within the intelligence community. So hopefully we'll just get back to that, so that it's not a partisan reporting that's done. It's not partisan analysis that is done. And if we do that, I think we'll be much more effective in repelling that, which is clearly a problem. I don't want to minimize this. This is clearly a problem, but we'll be more effective at repelling it if we take politics out of the assessment.
Thank you.
The next question is from Megan, and she writes, "It feels like there's increasing momentum in various states behind the movement to win the vote back for people convicted of felonies or on probation/parole. What do you see as the next steps to return those voters to the voter rolls? And can you talk about what positive changes that could bring?" She's a first-year graduate student in the School of Social Administration.
Yeah, when you study the history of felon disenfranchisement, this kind of taps into something that Jelani and I were talking about earlier. You have newly emancipated people who have political power, and you had African Americans serving in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, governors, in the South. The white status quo said, well, this is not good, and so let's figure out a way. Let's say, all right, let's pass a neutral law. Felons can no longer vote. Debate the merits of that, whatever. But then let's go arrest a whole bunch of Black people and make sure that they don't have the ability to vote. So if you look at the origins of it, that has got to be troubling. And then I've looked at the studies that show that as people are on the path of rehabilitation, that a significant plus is the ability to cast a vote and to feel that you are civically engaged, that you are a part of the electoral process. That in some ways, society is kind of saying, whatever it is that you did, we're welcoming you back and giving you back the power, the ultimate power that you have as a citizen. That is the right to cast a vote. What we saw in Florida, I think it was 63% of the people in Florida voted to re-enfranchise people who had felony records. You think about Florida, which always has, 535 votes separating people in elections. Over 60% of the people there decided that was the right thing to do, and that would have made a sea change in Florida, and potentially in the presidential election, which is of course why the Florida legislature, Republican legislature, decided that they would come up with this: you got to pay your fines and fees in order to cast a ballot, which is in essence, I think, a modern day poll tax. So I think, given its origins, given the rehabilitation impact that it has, just given the sense of the desire of the people, I think, around the country, and I think what you saw in Florida, that 60% vote, is reflective of generally of where people are in the country. If you've paid your debt to society, if you're out of prison, you've done the thing, you've done the time, why shouldn't you be allowed to participate in the electoral process? So for all those reasons, I think that's something that we should make a part of our sorry past.
We have a question from Dan Simon, and he should be on the screen shortly.
Hi, thanks both for being here. I'm a 3L at the law school, and I've interned at DOJ twice.
What division?
I'm sorry?
What division?
I was with the criminal appellate section and then with ED&Y.
All right, there you go, Brooklyn.
The Republican Party has been very comfortable breaking norms. And should the Democrats win the presidency and the Senate, should they move to admit Puerto Rico and the district as states? Voter suppression is a real concern. So why not ensure against it by adding 4 Democratic senators and, by my math, like 10 Democratic electors, and give, a whole lot more Democrats the vote, just not in certain states? Thanks.
Well, Dan, what I'd say is that the district ought to be a state. Puerto Rico ought to have the opportunity to decide if they want to be a state. But I'd say that on moral grounds. There are certainly going to be political positives that flow from that, I think, for the Democratic Party. But I live in Washington, D.C., all right? I pay taxes. Our boys and girls serve in the military. We're good citizens, and we do all the things that citizens are supposed to do. And yet I don't have the ability to have a voting member of Congress in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. And so I don't think that's necessarily breaking a norm. We have admitted states, people, I remember, you're not old enough to remember this, but back in, I guess, 1959, 1960, when Alaska and Hawaii became states, the notion that somehow you're going to have states admitted to the Union that weren't contiguous, to the United States. It's going to like, wait a minute, Hawaii's like out in the Pacific Ocean, and Alaska, that's like someplace near near where Santa Claus is, near the North Pole. And yet, we brought them in, had to couple them so that it was a Democratic state along with a Republican state. But I think the moral case can be made for the admission of DC as a state. But here's one thing I would say in terms of norm busting. If that means you've got to do away with the filibuster, well, that's a norm that I think ought to be busted, so that the Democratic majority in the Senate, with a Democratic majority in the House, and with a Democratic president, could do what I think is simply the right thing. And yeah, you're right. I mean, let's just be upfront about that. That'll have a positive impact probably on the Democratic Party. But I think, as I said, it's just the right thing to do. And maybe Republicans could compete for the votes of people here in the District of Columbia.
Wonderful, thanks.
I can add one historical footnote here, which is that Mr. Holder and I are both natives of Queens, New York. And there is a historical point to this, though. New York City, prior to 1898, New York City was just Manhattan.
Right.
Thoroughly, strongly Democratic stronghold. Brooklyn was a completely separate city, which is why Brooklyn is the only other borough besides Manhattan that has a downtown. Everybody else has a kind of sprawl. The powers that be in Albany really saw that they could never win in Manhattan, that Manhattan was always the Republicans could never win in Manhattan, it was always going to be Democratic. And so they thought if they conjoined Manhattan with Brooklyn, which was a thoroughly Republican area, they would wind up being able to cancel out the votes of Manhattan Democrats. And instead, the exact opposite happened. The people in Brooklyn were so pissed off that Brooklyn became a Democratic stronghold. So just to say that when you set up the game, when you play the game of creating new opportunities for yourself, sometimes you're creating new opportunities for your opponents.
Yeah. But to get back to Dan's point about norm busting, there should be, with all due respect, I love people in the Dakotas. There ought to be like one Dakota. Really? The North and South Dakota thing, that was all arranged in terms of Republican and Democratic politics. So it's not as if the admission of states is totally bereft of partisan considerations.
Mm-hmm. The next question is from Olivia, and she should be on video. Hi, Olivia.
Yeah, I'm Olivia Griffin. I'm a high schooler from the laboratory school as part of the university, but I'm also an editor for our school newspaper. And I was wondering, in an era of fake news, how you thought media and journalism affects partisanship and the growing divide within the country.
Well, I think that's a good question. And I don't think there's any question that that we have a more partisan, a more divided nation because of the nature of the news industry. Where, again, well before your time, Olivia, there were only 3 news channels that people could turn into. There were like, 6, 7 channels that you could watch on television. And it was ABC, NBC, CBS. And they played it, I think, pretty straight. People would say they had a liberal bias. I don't know. I think they played it, fairly straight. But now you've got, news stations, news networks that are clearly partisan in nature, and report the news through a partisan lens. And if you're a person who's only listening to one of those networks, one of those stations, you get all of your news through that lens. It's certainly going to shape the way in which you view politics. Generally, partisan things. Generally, it's going to make you more partisan. And then these news networks serve as echoes echo chambers for politicians who are saying outrageous things, making outrageous claims, and they come up with ways in which they they justify them. So I think, yeah, the news media, there's no question, has played a role in I think dividing us, making us more partisan in the way in which we view things. But here's one thing I would suggest to an aspiring journalist, I guess. I would never use the term fake news. That's freighted, it seems to me, with something Donald Trump is trying to perpetuate and trying to put into our collective DNA. And so that's a phrase I never use. I mean, I come up with ways in which you talk about, false reporting, whatever. I would just never ever use the term fake news. I'd use, if you want to describe the concept, I'd use other terms. That's a respectful suggestion.
Okay, we have one last question. That's from Joe Palin, and he should be on the screen in a moment. Well, I will ask a question while we're waiting for Joe to show up, which it's like kind of yes or no question. Are you going to write a book about these issues, about your time in the AG's office or whatever? Like, when are we going to get to read your vantage point on this?
Well, that's my publisher's asking the same question. My book was due in August of 2018.
Okay, all right.
And I got a really solid, I don't know, maybe 150, 175 pages. Mm-hmm. But I have total respect now in a way that I didn't before about people who write books. Mm-hmm. I ultimately will get this book done, but that's it. I am never ever going to commit myself to writing another book. This may be the hardest thing that I've ever done, and I have a very, very understanding and wonderful publisher who's been extremely nice to me, because I've blown through all my deadlines. But what I keep saying, well, now I can talk about the Trump years, and now I keep saying there's more stuff that I can put in the book now. So. But at some point, I think we have to make an end to it. It's interesting because, as a quick aside, Michelle Obama was, she was studious. I mean, she was disciplined in the writing of her book, and she sat down and did all of her stuff. President, he's not quite as disciplined as she was, and she points at me, it's like, this guy. And you look, I'm like the polar opposite. So she's, her book's done. She's done her tour, making movie. I mean, she's, the whole thing, and I'm still struggling through with mine. I wish I had her discipline.
If you have to come in dead last to two other people, though, that's not a bad set of choices. Joe, you have a question.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Cobb. Thank you, Attorney General Holder, and props for getting that book done. I'm with the Harris School of Public Policy, first year Master of Public Policy student. I guess to close this all off, what can we as constituents do for options in terms of combating voter suppression within our constituencies?
Well, I think maybe the primary thing to do is to vote. Because we have to realize that these voter suppression mechanisms and statutes and regulations, they didn't come down, Mount Sinai on tablets. I mean, they're just laws, they're just regulations. They can be undone. And so voting for people who will stand, as Republicans and Democrats, standing for Republicans and Democrats who will, stand behind a fair electoral system. Those are people who are worthy of our support. And then holding people accountable who stand for voter suppression, voting against them, making sure that they're out of office, and organize against these people. I think that in some ways, some people are one-issue voters, guns, whatever. This, for me, I think this ought to be a one-issue. This could make me a one-issue voter. If you stand for or have supported voter suppression measures, I'm against you. If you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, I don't care who I'm against that person, and I'll do all that I can to make sure that person is not reelected. So I think voting is certainly something to do. But then just getting more civically engaged, and confronting. Indivisible has a great handbook about how you influence people, going to district offices of congressmen and senators, and same thing of your state representatives. Just being more engaged in the process. I always end up these conversations kind of with this, Dr. King's quote that, the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. But the deal is it doesn't bend on its own. It only bends when people, like you, Joe, and Livia, put their hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And the question is, what are you doing? And so there's a myriad, there's a huge number of ways in which you can pull that arc towards justice and against voter suppression. They're extremely creative, in coming up with new ways to suppress the vote. We've got to be equally creative in our opposition to it. But at the end of the day, it involves people focusing on the issue, committing to resolving the issue, preparing to sacrifice to resolve the issue. And if we do all of that, I think we can get to a better place.
That's our last question. We'd like to thank Attorney General Holder for his time and thank everyone who contributed a question, as well as everyone who stayed with us for the course of this conversation over the hour. Good luck with the book. Good luck with the deadline. And I'll look forward to reading it.
All right. See you, Jelani. Always good to see you. Take care.
All right. Take care.